Hello, gentlemen and ladies. Streamers just came out with a new patch, and there's a lot to talk about this one. The wording on these changes are a bit weird, but don't worry. Your interpreter, Hooks, knows exactly what he's talking about here, and I'll make all these changes and such make sense. The biggest and most important change is this line right here. Set global maximum damage reduction to 80%. What this means is that, hypothetically, if you had 150% damage reduction by duct taping 2 Centurions on an epic heavy paladin, it will take 80% of all damage instead of the previous -1 damage that we are all used to. The knee-jerk reaction to this is likely, range just got a whole lot better. But wait, there's more. There are now player unit balances that we have to take into account. So let's go over those together. Armored, (except Paladins), have 10% max defense versus ranged. What does this mean? What max defense means is that 80% damage cap, meaning that all armored will take a maximum of 80% reduced damage to all sources, but in this case, it looks like that in ranged units, that damage reduction is increased to 90% for tanks, centurions, vampires, and orc slayers only. Rogues have plus 20% max defense versus ranged. That's exactly what it sounds like, meaning that if rogues get a defensive boost, they can go up to 100% defense against ranged. Suddenly, charming rogues just became viable, and I'm not even mad. Paladins have 10% max defense versus melee. So paladins are solidifying their spot as melee tanks. Okay, 90% damage reduction to melee. Okay. Melee ignore 10% max defense versus all targets. What this means is that if a melee attacks a unit, it will remove 10% of the maximum defense. For example, if a tank has all the defensive buffs, it has 80% damage reduction to melee, which means that when a melee attacks this tank, it will then strip 10% of that damage reduction for its damage, meaning that the tank will have 70% melee damage reduction. Moving on. Killing Field grants melee an additional 10% to ignore max defense. So this means a melee unit under the effects of Killing Field will make the tank in the previous scenario have 60% total reduced damage. Last, and certainly not least, Stronghold also grants 10% max defense to Armored. What this means is that under Stronghold, Paladins will be able to keep their 100% damage reduction against melee, and tanks, centurions, vampires, and orc slayers can regain their 100% damage reduction to ranged for the duration and the location of the spell. So let's talk about this a little. On the PvP side, ranged gets the long-awaited buff, and tank meta is effectively dead, as they can no longer have full damage and vulnerability from all sources, and instead have their own niches as to what they can tank. Nothing really changes for melee, except the tanks no longer laugh at them. Maybe they're much better in the small fights, but in large fights they just die too quickly by AoE to really matter in the first place. We didn't get to play with these changes for the full length of the most recent PvP, so we didn't get to fully test the changes, but I can say that PvP has definitely felt more fresh this go around. There are still more problems that need to be addressed, and there's much more testing that needs to be done, since the dust hasn't settled on what's the best way to play yet. But this is a good first step, and I actively encourage the CTV team to keep making these kinds of changes. In PvE, not having a tank line that's invulnerable to damage is going to change how campaigns and dungeons work, as well as how far you can get, depending if people relied on Armored in the first place. I think there will need to be way more care in future events, and a reassessment of certain mechanics and units that don't work with these changes. The Venus flytraps and the endless hordes of spiders come to mind. Unfortunately, the current Shrinkening event does not at all encourage the use of armored units, so we'll all have to wait for this event to end to test them on the portal maps, and then wait for Dungeons 4 to see the competitive side of PvE. I predict that certain maps will be impossible, especially since Stronghold only encompasses a very small portion of the map for huge captains. But the smaller and medium-sized captains can take full advantage of Stronghold as if the spell covered the entire map. I think some things are going to need to be tweaked so that Stronghold isn't such a necessary tool to simply be able to win certain maps. I'm looking at you, the Deep and the Jungle maps, as well as some adjustments for players to know when to soak hits using rogues and when it's more appropriate to have an armored line, such as the Pyramid boss in the Tomb Lands, one-shotting anything that isn't a rogue, versus Mastermind, which can be reasonably tanked by armored units. This one small change is definitely a game changer, and on a scale of 1 to 10 on the boldness scale, I would give this a 4, and I definitely encourage CTV to go crazier to mix things up. I'm cautiously optimistic with the future here, but what about you guys? Comment, like, subscribe. I'll be doing more Stream Raiders content from here on out, so I'll catch you guys in the next one. I love you.